everyone, and welcome to our chapters 9 through 11 lecture for our CIS 2757 C# programming course. This week we do have 3 chapters to go through, chapters 9, 10, and 11. And because of that, I'm going to do my best to keep this lecture not too long. So hopefully it is not a crazy long length. My goal is to just kind of do a brief overview of some of the things that we're covering this week in the chapters. And then obviously having read the chapter, some of these ideas should be reinforced through the lecture or vice versa if you watch the lecture first and then go read the chapter. But at certain points in the slide deck, I will reference a certain chapter, like having more information on stuff. So definitely read the chapters in their entirety. And then we'll go through what we have here in the slides. So just an overview for these chapters. We will be working with strings and the date time class. We'll learn about formatting numbers, dates, and times. We'll look at building more advanced Windows Forms apps. That's chapter 10. The first 2 are in chapter 9, I believe. I believe this one's in chapter 9 as well. And then learning professional debugging techniques. So if we go ahead and continue here, we'll first look at working with strings. So we've already looked at working with strings a little bit before. And I'm sure many of you have already had experience working with strings as we've done some of the labs and projects in the course. But we are just going to, some of this will maybe review for you, and some of it may be new information. All right. So many programs require you to work with the individual elements of a string, right? So for example, you may need to divide a string into multiple parts. So that is one way that we can work with strings, and we'll get more into that in a moment here. We can work with strings using either the string class or the string builder class. Okay, and these are 2 separate classes that both work with strings. Excuse me. So when creating a string, you are creating a string object from the string class. So because of this, you can use the string class's methods and properties with your string object. And you can also create a string builder object from the string builder class. And this allows you to use the methods and properties of the string builder class. Okay, important distinction here. So working with the string class, the string class has many methods that we can use, and page 279 of the course text shows a lot of these common methods. I have quite a few of them right here on this slide as well, though this may be a little bit small. So sorry if it is a little bit small. I'll zoom in a little bit right there for now while I'm looking at this. So these are some common properties and methods of the string class, right? So we have the indexer, so you can get the index of a string, right? If you think about strings, they're really just a list of characters. So you can get the character at a specified position, right? Using the index. So if you have your string and then in square brackets, you say, you make 0 the index, that's going to get the first character in your string. Okay, so that's how we can get characters at a specified position within our string. We can also use the length property. Remember, properties do not have parentheses, so we can use the length property. We could say our string's name.length. And then we can get the number of characters in the string. So if you need to know how long a string is, the length property is very useful. We have both the starts with and ends with method. This is just to see if our string starts with a certain string or ends with a certain string, and then it will return a Boolean based on whether it does or doesn't start or end with the string that is passed in, right? We also have index of and last index of. We have insert. We have pad left and right. We have remove. We have replace, right? So we can replace an old string with a new string. We have substring, 2 lower and 2 upper. So 2 lower makes, it returns a string in lowercase. 2 upper returns a string in uppercase. Trim is a great one. So trim returns a string with leading and trailing spaces removed. This is really handy when you're getting input from the user, right? So if the input and puts any spaces at the beginning or end of whatever they've input, you can just trim the user input and it'll get rid of those spaces. And then you have split, right? And split returns an array of strings where each element is a substring that's delimited by a specified character or characters, right? So we could split our string based on spaces, based on commas, right? And then we can get a bunch of different strings from one string. So these are some of the common ones. I just thought I'd put the screenshot in here. I'm not going to go into all of these methods, obviously, but some of them are used quite frequently and you should be aware of, such as trim, to lower to upper, split, the length property. Those are all used pretty frequently with the string class. Let me go ahead and make this smaller again so I can scroll easier. So we can also parse numeric input, right? So when users type input, it is a string, but sometimes you want them to give input that you want to do calculations on, right? And you can't do calculations on strings. So you can convert strings to numeric input using the parse and try parse, right? Both methods. So here's an example, right? We have int number equals int.parse, and we're parsing the input from the user here. And what we're doing is we're converting this string to a int, okay? But you're not always able to do this, right? So if we tried to do this and it wasn't a number, like if they typed in hello and we try to convert hello into an int, it's simply not going to work and you're going to get an error, which is why using try parse is a lot safer. And it is preferred in real world applications just because try parse is a lot safer and you avoid getting an error that could crash your application. Right, we also have string builder. So you can use string builder to build large strings. And in order to use it, you create a string builder object and you use the string builder methods to build your string. And string builder is very handy for receipts, reports, and also looping and appending text, okay? So whenever you need to create a string, just think about whether it is best to be using string or string builder, all right? We can also work with datetime, right? Datetime has a lot of properties and methods that we can use. These next few slides kind of cover some of them. I'll go into detail about some of them. Some of them I won't, just for the sake of time in the lecture. But I just wanted to make sure you guys knew that there are a lot of properties, there are a lot of methods, and it is worth reading through and seeing what they do, but some you won't use as often as others, right? So here's a couple datetime properties that are kind of common. We have now, right? So we could say variable.now, and then this will return the current date and time, okay? If we don't want the time and we just want the current date, we could say .today, and that returns the current date. There's some datetime methods here, too long date string and too short date string, right? So you can see in the description what that does. And then too long time string and short time string. Basically, whether you want to include seconds in your time. There's some more properties here with datetime. These are all kind of handy, right? So we have date. This returns the date time value with the time portion set to 12:00:00 a.m. And then we have month, day, year, hour, minute, second, right? These all return, an integer for whatever portion of the date time value. Time of day. We also have day of week, and we have day of year as well. And then we also have some datetime methods for performing operations, right? So you may want to add days, months, years, hours, minutes, seconds. So that is all here. There's methods for each of those. And then we also have just add by itself, and you pass in a time span, and it will add the specified time span value to a datetime value, and then return a different datetime value. And then you have the same thing, but for subtract, where you pass in a datetime. So those are some different methods and properties. Again, I'm not going to go super in depth with these because it would just take a lot of time and you're not going to be using a lot of these that often, but it is very handy to know. And so I would recommend reading through each of these and looking at the examples that are provided in chapter 9, I believe this is provided in the course text. Formatting numbers, super important. We've already done a little bit of formatting, if I remember correctly. So some of this you already know, but there are different formatting codes to format numbers properly, right? So we can use C for currency, E is for scientific notation, P is for percent, N is for number, right? So there is multiple different formatting codes. Again, in the chapter, it lists out quite a few more than this. I just wanted to give a few common examples. And then here I have two different examples of how you could use the format codes, right? So you might have a price variable and say price.toString, and then in double quotes put C. So this formats price as currency. And you can also do it with string interpolation, right? So here we have string interpolation, and we're saying price and then colon C, and this is telling us that price should be formatted as currency. I prefer the string interpolation way. I just think it looks a little bit cleaner, but you can use the toString way as well. And that's kind of what chapter 9 covers here. So date, time, strings, and then a little bit of formatting, right? Formatting numbers, and also like parsing numeric input. That's all in chapter 9. And then what happens in chapter 10 is we go a little bit more into Windows Forms. Now I'm just going over a little bit of the bare bones here. We have kind of used some of this stuff already, so some of this may seem familiar to you. We've used it in some labs and probably in some projects as well up to this point. But these are all very handy to know, and it is good to be sure about what each of these do if you weren't so sure. If you've been using a combo box, let's say, and you weren't entirely sure about what it was for and what exactly you could do with it. This chapter goes into some good detail about some of the other Windows Forms controls. And so, yeah, that's where we're going to start, is with Windows Forms controls. So the first one I want to look at is the combo box, right? This is useful for selecting an item from a list of items, right? So it reduces the chance of the user inputting wrong information. The way a combo box works is that you'll click an arrow for a drop-down menu, you'll select the item from a list of items, and then that is what will populate the combo box, okay? We also have the list box. This is the same as the combo box, right? So you can select an item from a list of items, but the list portion is always available, right? So the user can also select multiple options in a list box. In a combo box, you can only select one option. The radio button, this lets the user select an item from a group of items. So you can place radio buttons in a group box, and then the user can only select one radio button, and the others are auto deselected when you click on a new radio button. Okay, and I do have a visual example on the next slide. So don't worry if you need to also like see an example. I do have a visual example. And then checkboxes, right? This provides the user with choices and allows for multiple choices. You can have multiple checkboxes selected. So this is the visual example here from the book. You can see these 5 different controls here. So starting at the top, you can see that we have a group box at the top, and inside of the group box is a couple radio buttons, and you can see that credit card is selected. If we were to click on bill customer, then credit card would get deselected by default. Here we have a list box. You can see that the entire list is visible all at once, and you are able to select multiple items in the list box here. Card number is just input. The select a month and select a year, these are both combo boxes. If you click the arrow, right, it drops down, and then you can select, your year or your month from the drop down. And then we have a checkbox here at the bottom. We can check or uncheck it. There is only one, but if there was multiple, we'd be able to check multiple of the checkboxes, right? So these are kind of the visual examples of these different controls that we've talked about up here. Some of these you've already been using, but you may not have been using some of them, and you may find them handy as we continue to work more with Windows Forms and with C#. And obviously, these different controls also have member properties and methods. So you can see chapter 10 for more details on those. I'm not going to go in depth about them here, but each of these have some methods and properties that you can use. So go ahead and look in chapter 10 for that. I also wanted to look at tab order, right? Because I don't know that we've kind of like officially talked about what tab order does. I don't remember. It would have been, within the first week of class. So consider this kind of a brush up if we already did talk about it. But tab order determines the order that controls receive focus when tab is pressed, obviously, right? So the tab index property is where this can be controlled. And by default, tab index is based on when controls are added, right? So it'll go up a number every time you add a control, starting from 0. And then you can ignore certain controls with tab stop enabled or visible set to false. And so, yeah, this is basically just the user can tab through and it'll auto put them to different fields. And you can, specify you can specify that for them, excuse me. And yeah, so it's pretty handy. It's just a little thing, but it can go a long way when creating forms. So I do think it's important to take a look at it. And then something we haven't been doing is working with multiple forms. Okay, and this is important. So make sure you read through this section in chapter 10. But most applications in the real world use multiple forms, right? And this can be in the form of a main form and then some pop-up dialog boxes, right? So to add a form, you can go to project and then add new item, and then you select a Windows Forms form, okay? And if you need to rename a form ever, you can right-click it in the Solution Explorer and click rename and then type in the new name for a form. As a note, if you'll remember, like if we use a text box, we use the TXT abbreviation at the front of the name. For forms, we usually put FRM, okay? And then something we've worked with a little bit with forms is the message box class, right? So message box can be used to display information, show warnings, ask for confirmation, capture user decisions, right? And also prevent accidental actions like asking the user, are you sure you want to do this, or something like that. This could be especially handy if there's like a clear button or maybe like a button for closing the form. You ask, are you sure you want to close the form? Or are you sure you want to clear all contents? And chapter 10 goes into detail about how to use the message box class. We've been using it kind of a little bit unofficially on some labs and some projects. But now that chapter 10 kind of covers it, message box is a really handy class to be using, especially with multiple forms. And we will be working with multiple forms in the future here. So I would highly recommend paying attention during this part, making sure you understand how to use multiple forms, because it will be important going forward. We are going to be using multiple forms. Again, you see this often where you have a main form and then you click something and a pop-up dialog box may open, whether it's asking for confirmation or it's asking for some additional information or something like that. So we will be working with multiple forms in the future. And that is what chapter 10 covers. Chapter 10 covers kind of just more stuff with Windows Forms that we can do. And chapter 11 covers debugging. Now, I can't remember if at the beginning of class we covered debugging at all. I can't remember if it was this class or another class that we covered debugging, but some of this may be review, and that's okay. So debugging is the process of finding and fixing errors, right? There are 3 types of errors. We have compile time errors, we have runtime errors or exceptions, and then we have logic errors, okay? So compile time errors are syntax errors, okay? And this is where the code will not build because there's some type of error in the code. And compile time errors, Visual Studio is going to pick up on them before the programs even run. And that's when you see the red squiggle underlines in Visual Studio, right? So these are just syntax mistakes. They are semi-common. So you will run into them quite a bit, but that's okay. It is okay to run into errors. It doesn't mean you're a bad programmer. Professional programmers who have been programming for decades still have to debug their code. Okay, nobody writes code on the first go through. Perfect. Nobody writes perfect code on the first go through. Excuse me. Oops, didn't mean to scroll. And then we have runtime errors or exceptions, right? So this is where the program will compile fine, but it crashes while running, right? And you could get like a null reference exception or something like that, right? A divide by zero exception. So the program will compile, but while it is running, it will crash at some point and throw an exception. These are runtime errors. And then the most tricky ones, honestly, are the logic errors, okay? And this is where the program compiles, it doesn't crash, but the output is wrong, or at least it's not what you expected it to be, right? And that's because you have bad logic, right? So the most classic example you can think of is you're trying to do something like you're trying to do a math calculation, and the order of operations, right? You're not following order of operations. So you're doing some math operation and you expect the output 16, but you get the output 11. And it's confusing because your program compiles fine. It doesn't crash or get an exception, but the output you're getting is still wrong. So logic errors can be very tricky to debug because it's going to be something that you wrote that is just logically incorrect, right? So they are tough. They are probably the least common, I would say. I feel like exceptions and compile time errors are the ones you're going to run into the most. But logic errors will happen, and it's okay when they happen. You just have to look through your code and use some of these debugging techniques, and you will find the logic error. Um, and then I believe we've covered breakpoints, but just again to touch on them, breakpoints can be used to pause program flow, right? So to set a breakpoint, you can click in the far left margin and a big red dot should appear. This is a breakpoint. And what happens is the program will pause its running when it gets to that line of code. And what this does is it allows you to inspect variables and see what may be going wrong. It also allows you to pause the program and go line by line through the program to see how values and variables change, and also to see where loops or methods may get skipped because of conditions that aren't being met or are being met. So while inside of break mode, you can hover over variables to see the value stored in them. You can click the step into button. This executes one statement at a time. The step over button, which will execute one statement at a time, but it does not go into called methods. And then the continue button. And this just continues program flow either until the next breakpoint or until execution has finished. Another thing we can use while debugging is console.writeLine. So sometimes you just need console.writeLine to find errors. And you can use console.writeLine to display the value of variables at specific points. Maybe you want to see the value of a variable before and after you're supposedly assigning it a new value, just to see if it actually is getting assigned the new value. And you can also leave a message saying you got into a loop or method. Sometimes you just want to check if a condition is met, and if you're entering a loop. So you could put a console.writeLine at the beginning of a loop and say, I'm inside the loop. Then you run your program and you may see that that line of code doesn't actually get run. And then you know that wherever you're getting your error is before the loop, right? So you know that you're not entering the loop. So there's something wrong with the condition where the condition is not being met to enter the loop. And this is kind of stuff that you'll learn as you begin to debug your programs. But console.writeLine, it's very good for helping to narrow down where the error is occurring. Obviously, some errors are a little bit beefier, and you're going to need to use breakpoints and the debug mode. But for the most part, I tend to start with console.writeLine just to kind of narrow down where the error is if I think I understand what's going on. And then eventually, if the error is causing me a bit of trouble or it seems like it's going to be a bit of a bigger error, I use breakpoints to see how the code is behaving line by line. some common beginner mistakes, right? Not reading the error messages. Anytime your program crashes, it's going to give you error messages. So do read error messages when they are available. They will point you to where the program is running into an issue. Also, guessing instead of inspecting. You don't need to guess at what the error is or what you think the error is and start just throwing changes at the wall and see what sticks. Inspect your code, see if you can see what is going on. Not using breakpoints when necessary, right? Breakpoints are a helpful tool. They're your friend, and you should use them and the debug mode whenever you can to help address some of the issues you run into. And then overcomplicating fixes. And when you're faced with an error, my recommendation is slow down for a moment, observe what is happening, and then think about what is happening, think about what could possibly be happening, and think as you look through your code, right? So this is just some basic problem solving stuff. You should slow down, you should observe what's happening, and then you should think about the problem and how you can fix or solve the issue. So that is all for this lecture. That's chapter 11 is going through all of the debugging stuff. So in these chapters, we learned about how to work with strings and datetime, how to format numbers and output professionally, how to build more interactive Windows forms, how to use debugging tools, and the difference between compile time, runtime, and logic errors. So that is all for this lecture. Thankfully, this one did not end up too long just because we kind of skimmed over kind of a overview of the 3 lectures. So I would definitely recommend reading through the 3 chapters to get a more in-depth look at some of the concepts that we looked at here. Otherwise, we'd be sitting here for hours going into that. But yeah, that'll be all for this lecture. And I will see you guys in the next one.